All right, that's all right. Let's move on. Dan Gerstein is a communication advisor for Joe Lieberman, and he's come on here to represent that point of view, and we really appreciate that. Let's move on to the Foley scandal. We've got Joe Lieberman on tape saying he was never said that there was that there was a partisan frenzy over this scandal. Then later we have him on tape, Dan, saying, or earlier, a couple of days before that, saying, in fact, there is a partisan frenzy about this Foley scandal.
No, that's just another Lamont campaign fabrication. He was very clear in what he said. He said he didn't want this to turn into a partisan frenzy. There were signs that it was getting too partisan. And then when he was asked by one of the bloggers to sort of say, did you say that calling for Speaker Hastert's resignation was part of the partisan frenzy, he said no. Nothing he has said has criticized any Democrat by name or even suggested that the Democrats who are criticizing Speaker Foley are engaging in a partisan frenzy.
All right,
the point he's trying to make, and again, the Lamont campaign keeps missing this, is that we don't know all the facts. We need to get all the facts because it's not just Speaker Foley. There may have been other House Republican leaders who ignored this or tried to cover it up, and there should be a full accounting of it. And the reality is Joe Lieberman's taken pretty much the same exact position as Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid, and Howard Dean, and all the leading members of Congress, none of whom have called for Speaker Hastert to resign. They've called for an investigation.
All right, I'm going to come back to that point in 1 second, Dan, but let me run the second clip that we have there, JR, for you, and have you react to this. This is Joe Lieberman from a couple of days ago.
Things spinning out of control. It's become another partisan frenzy in Washington.
That is referring to the Foley scandal. It seems like he's saying that the Foley scandal has become a partisan frenzy, doesn't it, Dan?
Yeah, and I'm happy to acknowledge that point. I know he said that. What he didn't say though was that anyway, talking about Speaker Hastert's role in this specifically, or calling for his resignation, was in itself overly partisan. The point he was making was, let's remember that real kids were hurt here, and that we need to get an accounting of the facts and then hold people accountable based on the investigation, which, again, is the same position that most other leading Democrats in Congress. Frankly, if you guys know of a leading Democrat in Congress who's called for Hastert to resign, I'd like to know about it. I haven't heard it. He's taking the same position as Nancy Pelosi. This is another case of the Lamont campaign making things up.
All right, Dan, let me talk about that distinction, then. And we're talking to Dan Gerstein. He's a communication advisor for Senator Lieberman and his campaign in Connecticut. First of all, just the very fact of saying that this is partisan, of course, hurts the Democratic position because it makes it seem like it's a political issue rather than an issue where we're concerned about the kids, etc. So that's one issue. But the second issue is the one.
I just got to interrupt you real quick.
Okay.
Because the most of the criticism Joe Lieberman has made in this case, and again, this is something Lamont campaign is outright misleading people on, has been about the Republican response. When he was on Imus, and I will send you guys the transcript, the first thing he said was to criticize the Republicans for dredging up past Democratic scandals as a way to deflect attention from what Foley did. He said that was wrong.
Okay.
And then he criticized Congressman Shimkus, who's the Republican leader of the Page Board, for not sharing the information with the Democratic leader of the Page Board. Again, the primary criticism he's made of partisan activity has been of the Republicans, and then he's just sort of said both sides shouldn't let this become partisan. How is that an unreasonable comment?
Well, it's an unreasonable comment because it makes it appear for the 18th time that the Democrats are the ones being partisan when it was the Republicans who were covering it up.
Making that appearance, but the only people who are making that appearance is not Joe Lieberman, it's the Lamont campaign.
No, I think that appearance is on its face, Dan. I mean, I see those quotes, and I think the appearance is very clear. But all right, let's move on to the second part of what you're saying, that he's in line with Pelosi, et cetera, because he's called for an investigation. But the reality is, early on, he called for an independent investigation, Joe Lieberman did. And then later on, he seemed to change and say, oh, no, the bipartisan ethics committee investigation will be good enough, that's independent enough. Now, I find a huge problem in that, because you remember, of course, that Hastert originally fired, basically, fired is not the right word, but moved Joel Heffley, a very conservative Republican, out of the ethics committee as the chairman of the ethics committee when he actually did real investigations of Tom DeLay. And he moved in Doc Hastings, who's taken money from Tom DeLay and Dennis Hastert. Doc Hastings is a guy who is not at all impartial, and he's been put in charge of the ethics committee, and he would be in charge of this investigation. Now, why wouldn't someone who's a liberal Democrat from Connecticut object to that?
Well, let's go back to the facts and actually look at what Joe Lieberman said. What he said, yes, he wanted an independent investigation, and he said the ethics committee there is an inherent conflict of interest, and it's not the optimal way to do this. And that's why he proposed, and again, this is something that the Lamont campaign will never acknowledge, and he played a leadership role in proposing the creation of an Office of Public Integrity that would have an independent investigatory ability to look into matters like this. However, that legislation got blocked by the Republicans. It's not going to happen. So the option we have is the House Ethics Committee. That's the only option we have. And
no, you can do an independent investigation.
House Leader Pelosi called for the House Ethics Committee to investigate it. She's applauded them for doing so. So again, I think there's another case of selective persecution going on here, where Joe Lieberman is getting criticized for something that Nancy Pelosi is doing.